In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this top inspired by an Alexander McQueen knitted piece. I often look to see what big brands do in their knitwear collections, and I loved this one so much. And unfortunately, because I cannot afford it, I decided to try and make one. I'm thinking to start a Kenshi DIY series where I try to replicate garments that I see online. This way I can make nice stuff for myself and I can share with you the process so we can all learn together. So if you have any suggestions, please share them with me in the comments. Alright, so first I roughly sketched how I imagined that the top was constructed. I could see that the front panel was split into two parts at the bottom which overlap, and the same was done for the back. The second step was to try and knit that shape. This is the first trial in waste yarn. I didn't really think it overlapped nicely in the middle, so I knitted one more version and I used short rows to shape the sections so they overlap a little bit nicer, and I decided that this is how I will construct the top. Once I decided what yarn I was going to use, which is a viscose merino blend, I knitted my tension swatch and calculated my gauge. I like to do that in two different ways, either by counting stitches or measuring the tension swatch like I'm doing in this video. By doing some simple maths, I learned how many stitches and how many rows I have per 1 centimeter. I measured another top that I have, which has a dropped sleeve, which I want to do for this jumper, just to know roughly what size to make the top, and I wrote all that information on paper. Using my gauge, I began converting centimeters to stitches and rows. It is super easy to do that. Once you know your gauge, all you have to do is to multiply your centimeters by the number of stitches or rows you have per 1 centimeter. Of course, I then did a little test in the final yarn that I will be using for the top. It is always important to test and see what works. This is always part of the process. I measured a test sample and myself to decide on the size of the bits that overlap at the front. In the original design, you can see that the overlapping parts are sewn to the side. To be on the safer side, I thought it would be better to tie them around myself rather than sewing them. This way I don't have to be as precise with the measurements, and since this is the first time I'm trying something like this, I just didn't want to risk it. If I ever want to knit another one like that, I can always use the first sample, which will be this one, and just have that as a guide to get a more accurate version of that top. Once I wrote all those measurements and converted them to stitches and rows, I have a plan for the bottom part as well. I haven't decided on the sleeves yet. Sometimes when I do drop sleeves, I prefer to knit the front and back and then work on the sleeves. Alright, so the top will be knitted bottom to top, and the two sections at the bottom will be knitted one at a time. I'm making sure to divide my needles already and know exactly how many stitches every section will be, and make sure that the top is centered on the machine. As you can see, I'm beginning with 1 stitch only, but I will increase 1 stitch every 2 rows until I have 10 stitches. Then I will knit some rows straight, and that is the part that will be tied at the side. I find that when a strap like this has a pointy end, it looks so much better than having it straight. So basically, I think this looks better than if I would just cast on 10 stitches straight from the beginning. Here is how many stitches I will have to increase, and I will do that both sides. And I will do my increases the lazy way, which means I will not be grabbing the purl bar to form a new stitch and create an eyelet instead. This is one of my favorite ways to increase. It's quick and kind of cute. Once I increase the total number of stitches, I will create the curve I showed you at the beginning, and we'll do that by using short rows. I chose to not wrap the yarn around the last needle to avoid getting the little hole, but I honestly don't mind it. It just adds a nice little detail. Or maybe I'm just lazy again. Once I finish with that, I will knit 2 rows all needles. Here is the first side done. I have a feeling that the strap is a little bit too long, but let's just see how it looks when the top is finished. The 2 sides are complete, they are the same but mirrored. I will add my comb and weights, and I'm ready to knit the remaining rows for the body. I like to e-wrap any loose ends or tails whenever I can to not have to do that at the end and just save me a little bit of time. The body is all done. All I have to do is the neckline, and that is super simple. I will just do a slash neckline, but I will just knit 4 rows of purl stitches for the opening. So I will transfer all the stitches for the neckline from main bed to ribber bed and knit 4 rows. This is such an easy way to have a cute and neat neckline without much effort. Once I knitted the 4 rows, I will transfer all stitches back to main bed. I like to do a chain stitch cast off, and usually I will knit the last row on tension 10. This is a chunky yarn, so tension 10 doesn't give me a much looser row than the tension I'm using to knit with. So I will pull the needles all the way out, push them back and trap the yarn inside the closed latches, and holding a loose tension will knit a loose row. If you'd like to try this method, I definitely encourage you to do a test before jumping into a final project, just to ensure that the stitches are not too loose, because that can also not look that great. After that, pull the needles all the way out, remove the weights and comb, and using a latch tool or needle, chain stitch to cast off. More often than not, I will wash the garments once they are put together and finished. But this time, after trying it on, I thought that the front was way too long. Like I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first time I'm knitting such a garment, so I kind of guessed the measurements based on a simple top that I have. But because this is different, the same length doesn't look very nice when overlapping the bottom bits. It looked quite unflattering and not as modern as I hoped. Here is a top pinned to the side that looked as I envisioned it. I like the bottom part to overlap at the waist, which seems to be the most flattering. Before deciding on how many rows to unravel, I will actually wash the panels. This yarn shrinks a little bit, so I just want to make sure that I'm getting it right. So I will wash the front. I like to use warm water and just a regular detergent, and use a towel to remove as much of the water as possible. I will leave the panels to dry flat on a dry towel and come back to it tomorrow, which for you is just a second later. Again, I tried it on and pinned it to the size that I thought was right. I will count the excess rows and make a mark on that row plus 4 that will be the purl stitches rows. I then reattach the panels back on the machine, making sure that I always cut the same row. I unravel those rows using my little manual cone winder. I'm making sure to use the same yarn I unraveled to knit these 4 rows. I don't want to use yarn from the main cone as this yarn has already been washed and I do not want these rows to look different than the rest. It seems such a logical thing to do, but this is also just such an easy mistake to make. Trust me, I've done it before. The front panel is now fixed. I also knitted the sleeves. Sorry, but I didn't record any of that. But as you can see, I did 2 versions as I didn't like how the first one fitted. This was also something new that I tried and it didn't work from the first try. However, I'm happy with the final sleeve. It's the one on the right. I hope that you thought that one looked better as well. I'm ready to assemble the top. I will begin with the shoulder seam. I'm using a darning needle to do that. I really enjoy hand sewing even though I do have a linker. Just making sure to catch every stitch like so. Shoulder seams are done, the sleeves are next. Of course, I made sure to also wash the sleeves and let them dry before sewing them. I found that if I catch 1 stitch from the sleeve and alternate catching 1 and then 2 of the stitches bars, just like you would do when doing a mattress stitch from the body, gives a really nice and even seam. Of course, you have to try that depending on the yarn that you are using and your gauge, but this works, I think, every time when I'm doing it. Here I'm using a mattress stitch to sew the underarm and side seam. And here's the finished product. I'm so proud of this top and I really like how it turned out. I cannot see myself right now, so I'm trying to tie it as neatly as possible. I just wanted to show how that works. If you would like to know all the measurements, the gauge and all the written instructions for this top, kind of like a written pattern, join me on Patreon. There you can support my channel so I can continue making videos like this one, and you will also have access to extra content not available on YouTube. Thank you so much to everyone who has been supporting me there over the last almost 3 years. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I loved making this top and it's definitely a fun and different shape. I will leave a link with the original McQueen top if you want to see it properly. And that is it. See you next week. Bye bye.